Hello everyone, I hope you are doing well, and thank you for joining us today in our free workshop about convolutional neural networks. As you know, this workshop is brought to you by Code Labs Academy, an online learning platform that offers highly interactive learning. It offers a variety of learning methods such as workshops and bootcamps in different domains, data science, web development, security, etc. When you enroll in a bootcamp, you get access to one-to-one career coaching and all the educational content. You also have the ability of going through the learning content at your own pace. Now, let's start our workshop with a quote from a famous American scientist and researcher, Fei Li, who served as the director of Stanford's AI lab from 2013 to 2018 and is also chief scientist of AI and ML at Google. She says that if we want machines to think, we need to teach them to see. So what do we mean by teaching machines to see? Computer vision is a field of artificial intelligence that enables computers and systems to derive meaningful information from digital images, videos, and many other visual inputs. And it takes actions or make recommendations based on those information. It works much the same as a human vision, just except humans are always learning from what's around them because the human side, have the advantage of lifetime context to train and to tell objects apart, how far they are, whether they are moving, etc. But computers learn a specific thing on a certain amount of data. So the same way we look at things with our eyes, computers look through a camera, and the same way we process data with our brains, computers use the neural networks, in this case it will be convolutional neural networks, to finally make the decision or output a conclusion. After getting a glimpse of what computer vision is, we will be going through a brief history of it, exploring neural networks and convolutional neural networks, defining what images are for computers, and how CNN architecture is made. And we will wrap up with a coding example. So, how did it all start? Experimentation began in 1959 when neurophysiologists Hubble and Wiesel discovered simple and complex cells in the brain. They discovered them by showing a cat an array of images, attempting to correlate response in its brain. They discovered that it responded first to hard edges or lines, and scientifically, this meant that the image processing starts with simple shapes, like those straight edges, which are done by the simple cells. And then, a complex cells respond to those edges and bars, but of particular orientation in a particular location in the scene. Later on, and inspired by Hubble and Wiesel's work, and specifically in 1980, Dr. Fukushima designed an artificial neural network that mimics the functioning of simple and complex cells. The main idea of Fukushima's neoconitron, the name of the neural network, was simple. It was to capture the complex patterns, for instance, dog or cat, using the complex cells. Those complex cells gather their information from the simpler cells that detect simpler patterns. For instance, if we have a dog, we want to detect a tail. If we have cats, we want to detect specific ears or mustaches, etc. Although the work of Fukushima was very powerful in the newly developing field of artificial intelligence, the first modern application of convolutional neural networks was implemented in the 90s by Yann LeCun. He trained a convolutional neural network with the MNIST dataset of handwritten digits. The MNIST database contains training images and testing images with a total of 70,000 images taken from the American Census Bureau. This dataset contains images of handwritten digits from 0 to 9 with their labels that represent which number they actually are. So the network designed by Yann LeCun was to do classification on these numbers. After that, most of state-of-the-art architectures that came after were from the ImageNet Large-Scale Visual Recognition Challenge, or ILSVRC for short. It's an annual competition with the goal to promote the development of better computer vision techniques and to benchmark the state of the art. This challenge focuses on multiple tasks for image classification that includes both assessing a class label to an image based on the main object in the photograph, and an object detection that involves localizing objects within the photograph. In this graph, we see some of the most famous and powerful architectures that emerged from the ILSVRC, and on the y-axis we have their correspondent error rate. For instance, we find AlexNet supervision from the University of Toronto. It performed best or even top results on the ILSVRC 2012 for image classification tasks with an error rate of 16.4. Later on, Inception or GoogleNet by Google, which achieved top results for object detection, it had an error rate of 6.7. And not so far, ResNet from Microsoft research team, which achieved top results for object detection and object detection with localization tasks with their residual neural network in 2015 with error rate of 3.57. Coming to this workshop, I assume that you have some basic knowledge about what are neural networks, so we will go through an overview of them. So what are neural networks? Neural networks are a set of algorithms inspired by the functioning of a human brain. Generally, when you open your eyes, what you see is called data and is processed by the neurons. They are the data processing cells in your brain, and they recognize what's around you. That's how similar the neural network works. They take a large set of data, process the data, meaning they draw patterns from it, and outputs the result. In more technical terms, neural network receives an input, a single vector, and transforms it through a series of hidden layers. Each hidden layer is made up of a set of neurons, where each neuron is fully connected to all neurons in the previous layer. The last fully connected layer is called the output layer. The way single neuron works is that it takes as input values from the input data, weights of the network, and a bias. The input and weights are multiplied and summed with the bias at each neuron. The result transits through the activation function. We will talk a bit more about activation functions in later slides. Thus, the general idea is that this activation function will decide if a neuron is activated or not. And the activated neuron will transfer information into the other layers. With this approach, the data gets propagated in the network until it reaches the output layer. CNNs, on the other hand, also known as convolutional nets or convnets for short, are a variation of the regular neural networks. Why do we use CNNs? The reason we use CNNs is that with regular neural networks, concrete data points must be provided. For example, in a model where we are trying to distinguish between dogs and cats, the width of the noses or the length of the ears must be explicitly provided as data points. And that's what is a loss in spatial information. Here in this image, for example, we wouldn't know that the two highlighted boxes are the edges of the cat's left eye. When using CNN, these spatial features are extracted from the image input. It makes CNN ideal when thousands of features need to be extracted. Instead of having to measure each individual feature, the convolutional neural network will gather these features on its own. Another reason is that neural networks are not translation variant. This means that a cat's face found in two different places in a picture is not handled the same way, so we wouldn't know that it is the same thing. Furthermore, if we use regular neural network for image classification problems, then it will be difficult because a two-dimensional image needs to be converted into a one-dimensional vector. This is called as flattening, and we will explore it as part of the CNN's architecture. This will increase the number of trainable parameters exponentially, and increasing the number of parameters will take storage and processing capability. For instance, in this example, we have a 244 by 244 RGB image, meaning 3 channels. Thus, we will need around 179,000 neurons. In other words, it will be expensive. Compared to its predecessors, the main advantage of CNN is that it automatically detects the important features without any human supervision. This is why CNN would be an ideal solution to computer vision and image classification problems. Some of CNN's applications are edge detection, meaning we have an input image and we want to detect the edges that are in this image. We apply filters for edge detection. We would want maybe to detect only the vertical edges or the horizontal ones or the ones that are inclined at 20 degrees. It depends on our desired output. Another application is object recognition. Well, here we have two parts. We will have object detection and object recognition. The object detection is just detecting an object. For instance, putting those bounding boxes you see around things. And object recognition will tell us what that object is. For instance, here it tells us for both animals that one of them is a horse and the other one is a dog. The Facebook application you use that will tell you to tag a certain friend and will detect its face from many faces. This is face recognition. It's used by the use of convolutional neural networks. And also for medical imaging, it is used to detect tumors or anomalies in imaging or in X-rays, etc. We have been talking so far a lot about images. So what are images? The simplest form of images is in grayscale, meaning that the image is transformed into a pixel matrix, where each having a value between 0 and 255. The value 0 means black, and the value 255 means white. The more we are closer to 255, the lighter it is, and the more we are close to 0, the darker it is. So in this case, the computer will only need to store this value in one address. As you can see in the picture here, it's the one of President Abraham Lincoln. The original image is transformed into a matrix of pixels, where each dark spot in the original image is represented by 0 in the matrix, or close value to it if it's not really black. And vice versa, each light spot is represented by 255 value or close value if it's not really white. But computers usually read colors as a series of 3 values, red, green, and blue, RGB, on the same 0 to 255 scale. Just that now, each pixel actually has 3 values for the computer to store. If we are, for instance, to put colors on the previous image of President Lincoln, the picture before was a 12 by 16 matrix. That would lead to 12 by 16 by 3 values, which is 576 numbers. How is the CNN architecture? We will first go over an overview of it, and then we will explore each of these components in details. A simple ConvNet is a sequence of layers. In more details, we have an input layer, which will hold the input image as a 3D array of pixel values. Then we will have a convolutional layer, which will compute the product between a filter and an input image. After that, we have an activation layer. In this case, it's called the ReLU because it's one of the most used activation functions, which we will see in future slide. Then we have a Pulley layer, which will perform downsampling over the original image. And lastly, we have a fully connected layer, which will give us the output. For instance, in case of classification, it will compute the class score for each of the classification categories. As we explained earlier, CNNs work with images. The input is an image. It's an RGB image, meaning it has 3 channels, and each one is a matrix of pixels. The width of the input is the width of the matrix. The height of the input is the height of the matrix, and the depth of the input is the number of channels. For instance, we are working with RGB. We have 3 color channels, red, green, and blue, meaning that it has a depth of 3. Convolution is the first layer to extract features from an input image. It's parameterized with a stride and a pattern, which we will talk about soon. The objective of the convolution operation is to extract high-level features from the input image, and this is done by multiplying the filter with the input array. Doing this once will give us a single value. As you can see here, the filter is moving each time, where each position will give us only a single value. As the filter is applied multiple times to the input array, the result is a matrix of output values that represent a filtering of the input. The output matrix is called a feature map. So, a filter is a matrix, but it is smaller than the input data. This filter will be passing over the input image, and a dot product is made. A dot product is an element-wise multiplication between this filter and the part of the image that is covered by the filter. Convolutional neural networks do not learn a single filter, but in fact, they learn multiple features in parallel for a given input. For example, it's common for a convolutional layer to learn from 32 to 512 filters in parallel for a given input. Now you'll see some examples of filters. Let's take this image and see how processing it through filters will be. If we are first to do the identity filter, meaning to keep it the same, we will have the same feature map as output. Then we can do edge detection. As you can see, these are just some examples of filters that are used within the edge detection mechanism. For instance, we will want to detect vertical edges, so we apply a certain filter. And then we want to detect a horizontal edge, we apply different filter. We will also see this in our coding session. We can also use filters to sharpen the image, to sharpen the edges, to make it look clearer, or even to blur it. We have different types of blurs, for example, box blur, Gaussian blur, etc. We talked before that the convolution operation is parameterized with stride and pattern. So what's stride? A stride is the number of pixels we shift the filter with over the input matrix. When the stride is 1, then we move the filters to 1 pixel at a time. When the stride is 2, we move it 2 pixels at a time, and so on. For instance, here, the green filter is moving 1 pixel at a time. But if we were to apply a stride of 2, instead of going to the second pixel at the second time, we will go to the third one, because we are skipping 2 pixels at a time. And sometimes this filter does not fit perfectly into the input image. So we have 2 ways of handling this. We either could drop the parts of the image in order for the filter to fit in the image. This is called the valid padding. Or we put enough zeros around the original matrix so that we are padding the matrix, and the filter would put perfectly without loss of any information. We mentioned earlier a bit activation functions, so now we will explore them a bit. Activation functions are used at the end of a hidden layer to introduce nonlinear complexities to the model, because most of the events in the world are most of the time nonlinear. Activation functions will help us decide if the neuron should fire or not. We have different types of activation functions, just as you see in this figure. But for the case of convolutional neural networks, we will focus on the rectified linear unit, or ReLU. ReLU function is the most widely used activation function in neural networks today. It has the advantage that it does not activate all neurons at the same time. From the image here of the ReLU activation function, you'll notice that it converts all negative inputs to 0, and the neuron does not get activated in this case. This makes it very computationally efficient, as few neurons are activated by time. Also, statistically, it's proved that ReLU converges 6 times faster than the sigmoid or tangent H activation functions. which makes it very efficient. The Pulley layer is responsible for reducing the spatial size of the convolute feature, meaning the feature map. And this is done to decrease the computational power required to process the data through dimensionality reduction. It's also useful for extracting dominant features in order to maintain the process of effectively training our model. There are two types of pooling. We have max pooling and average pooling. Max pooling returns the maximum value from the portion of the image covered by the filter. For instance, here, if we are going to see the orange patch of the input image, we will take the maximum value of 0, 4, 9, and 3, meaning 9, and we have 9 as a value in our pooled feature map. On the other hand, if we use average pooling, then we will return the average of all the values from the portion of the image covered by the filter. So we will be assuming 0 plus 4 plus 9 plus 3, which gives us 16. To average it, we divide it by 4 because we have 4 values. So we have an output of 4. And this value will be in our pooled feature map. The size of the pooling operation or filter is smaller than the size of the feature map. And it's almost always 2 by 2 pixels applied with a stride of 2 pixels. If you see here, we have a stride of 2 because we are each time skipping by 2 pixels. The blue patch starts after 2 pixels from the beginning of the matrix. This means that the Pulley layer will always reduce the size of each feature map by a factor of 2. Here we have a 4 by 4 feature map, and after pooling it, we have a 2 by 2 pooled feature map. Before going to the final step, we need to flatten our matrix. Flattening is converting the data into a one-dimensional array in order to input it to the next layer. So we flatten the output of the pooled feature map because it is the last layer before going to the final layer. We convert it from a two-dimensional matrix to a one long single feature vector so that we can connect it to the final layer in the model, which is the fully connected layer. This fully connected layer is used for the classification of the complex features extracted from the previous layers. It is the same as the one in the neural networks, in which each neuron is connected to all the neurons on a consecutive layer. The final output is calculated using softmax, which gives the probability of each class for a given feature. In today's coding session, we will be exploring with an image and see how filters work. Then we will explore also the Fashion MNIST dataset, and we will perform classification tasks on this dataset using both a dense model and a CNN model. First, there are some imports that needs to be done. We will start by importing TensorFlow, which is a library made by Google for machine learning development. It is used for building and deploying machine learning modules. TensorFlow has two versions, the 1.x and the 2.x version. They are similar, just that the second version uses a better API, cleaner API, and has some slight upgrades. So as we can see here, Collabs imports the latest version, which is the 2.8. There are some other imports we need to do. For instance, we need to, from matplotlib, we need to import pyplot, which is a Python library, which will help us with plotting 2D arrays and images, etc. We will also need to import the module that will allow us to do inputs and outputs, which is from Sky Image. It is from scikit-learn, so we will import IO for input-output. And we will also need to import OpenCV, which is called here CV2. OpenCV will make available all the functionalities for processing images, etc. Another important line we should include is the matplotlib inline. Matplotlib inline will do the necessary setup, behind the scenes setup for us, so that we can use matplotlib without any problems. Next, we will read an image. We can read any image from the net. For instance, just using the io.imread, and we include the URL. I get a URL of an image of the house. You can choose anything you want and that you want to perform convolution and all over it. So we do this. This is our image. And then we can plot the image using the pyplot. So what we will do pld.mshow, and we give it the image. As you can see here, we have our image. As we saw in the slides, grayscaling is the basic form of images. So we can transform the RGB image, in this case the colored image, to a gray image, and this is done by using OpenCV. So what we will do is that we call a function called CVT color from OpenCV, and we will give it two inputs. As first input, it will take our original image, in this case the image, and it will take another parameter which will allow us to convert our original image from one color space to another. So what we have is that it's cv2.color. We are in RGB, so we go from RGB to gray, as you can see here. This is our grayscale image, and then we plot the image always using the pyplot. So we have imshow, we give it the gray image, and we need to tell pyplot that we are in grayscale space. So we tell it that it is gray with using the CMAP parameter. And as you can see here, our image is grayscale. We said that filter and images are just matrices, and one very beautiful and clean and best ways to handle images, which are matrices and 2D arrays, etc., is by using NumPy, a Python library for just integrated for this. So we will import NumPy, and then we create the filters as an array, a matrix, an array of arrays. I will get a filter which will allow us to detect the vertical edges. As you can see here, so our filter will have it's a 3x3 filter, and we have ones on both sides, meaning that it will be light on both sides, and 0 in the middle, meaning it's dark in the middle. So we have a vertical edge to detect. Then what we do is that we will pass this filter over our image. We do this by using OpenCV. So our filter image will be cv2.filter2d, because we have a 2D image. It's in grayscale, so filter 2D. We give it our input image, which is gray image. We also, there is a depth, which will tell OpenCV what depth to output the image with. Here -1 means that we want to output and depth the same as the original image, and we give it the filter we want to apply. Then we plot the image, usplt.imshow, we give it the filtered image, and we indicate that it's in grayscale, so we say gray. And here, as you can see, it will detect for us the vertical edges. Next, we will be exploring the Fashion MNIST dataset. The Fashion MNIST is a dataset of Zalando's article for images. It consists of a training set of 60,000 images, and the testing set of 10,000 examples. Each of these images, each of the example is 28 by 28 grayscale image, and it is associated with label from 0 to 10 to 9, meaning 10 classes. Well, in fact, the MNIST dataset is the first dataset researchers try. They say that if it doesn't work on MNIST, it won't work at all. But well, if it does work on MNIST, it may still fail on others. So the Fashion MNIST dataset is directly available on the TensorFlow API. We just use tf.keras. We have a bunch of datasets here, and we import the Fashion MNIST. Dataset, and then we have to load the training images and their corresponding trainer labels. We also have to load the test images and their corresponding test labels, so that we can test how our model is doing on new data. And we do this by calling the load function. Load data function. Then we can have a visualization of these data and how are they, including the classes, by simply executing this. So we have, as we said, 10 classes. So one for t-shirts, one for trousers, pullovers, dress, coat, sandal, shirt, sneakers, bag, and ankle boots, making it 10 classes. So as you can see here, this is a sample of the data set with the existing images and each their corresponding labels. From the training images, of course. We can just see one image at a time. For example, we will use by plot again. So we give it, for example, we want to see just the first image. We tell it that it's grayscale. And as you can see here, this is the image of the ankle boot. And we also said that images are just matrices, so we can see this as a matrix by simply printing it. So we have training images of 0, and we can see it as a matrix. You can see here in the output that all the values are from 0 to 255. But if we are to train our neural network, we will need to do something called normalization, normalizing our data. That we make it between 0 and 1. Why we want to do that? We want to make it between 0 and 1 because it will make our model converge faster. And if the data is not normalized, so the shared weights of the network have different calibrations because the range is big, from 0 to 255, which can also make the cost function converge very slowly and effectively. One way to do that with Python, since it's just a matrix, so we divide it by the range. And since we have in values from 0 to 255, so 255 minus 0 gives us 255. So we will divide the whole by 255. The same thing for test images. We normalize them. And if we are, and if we are to see the first sample again, so we do training images of 0. We can see that now the values are between 0 and 1. Now we will build our first simple dense model. So as we saw, the architecture is a sequence of layers. So our model here will be from also TensorFlow. We have Keras, and we have models. It will be a sequential model because it's sequence of layer. Sequential. Next, we will be adding layers to this sequential model. First, we will add a dense layer. So we have the TF TensorFlow that us that we have layers, and we will add the first one is the flattening layer. So as we said, we need to give it as input a one-dimensional array and not two-dimensional one. Then we will add a dense layer. This layer we will give it 128 nodes in this case, meaning neurons, and we can give it more or we can give it less. The more neurons we have, the more complicated it will be, the more calculations will be needed. Well, it will take longer time, but it will have better accuracy. And we also need to give it an activation function. We will use the ReLU activation function as we saw because it's the most widely used. We also will be needing to have our fully connected layer, the output layer. Well, just for information, that dense layer means the same thing as a fully connected layer. So we will be giving it here another dense layer. And since we have 10 classes, so we will have 10 neurons and an activation function of softmax. So what softmax does is that for each input, it will take the output of the previous layer and calculate the probabilities of that input belonging to each class. So that softmax, as you can see here. This is in order to build models. This is first to build our model. Then the next step, before training our model, we need to compile it. Compiling the model, what does it mean? Is that we give it some parameters that they are taken into consideration while training. For instance, we specify what loss function we have. It will measure how accurate our model is during training. We also give it an optimizer, meaning how our model is updated based on the data that it has seen, and also a metric to monitor the training and the testing steps. Next, we will train our model, and we do that by calling the fit function. So we are trying to fit those images to their labels. It will extract correlations and similarities that will allow it to detect them in the dataset that it has not seen before. And we also give it the number of epochs, meaning how many times it will see the dataset. Also, the more it goes over the dataset, the more accurate it will be. But just for the sake here, we will do just 5 epochs so that we can see how it's doing. Next, we can evaluate while it's training. We can evaluate our model just to see its accuracy. So we evaluate the model by calling the evaluate function, and we give it the test data, test images, and the test labels. As you can see here, it has accuracy of 0.7, meaning 87%. 87% of the classes in the test set were correctly identified. Next, we can make predictions. For example, here we have classifications by using model that predict, and we give it just the test images, and it will predict the labels for us. If we take a look at only one classification, for instance, for the first test image, so the classifications of 0, we will see here that it will output an array of 10 values. Each of these values represent a probability of this test image belonging to each of those 10 classes. we can have a better visualization so that we can understand better. So first, what we will do, we will take the maximum probability from each input. So the maximum probability meaning that it's high likely that this image belongs to this class. After that, we will execute this code so that we can see that for the first 25 images how it is doing. Here we can see that for instance here it predicted it correctly, but if we are going to see, for instance, here the prediction class was 2 whereas the original class was 4. Same thing here, the prediction class was 5 but the original class was 9, and this is because it has an accuracy of 87%. Now we can go and build our CNN model the same way as with the dense model. It is a sequence of layers. So we will be using .keras.models to use sequential model. And then we will be adding layers to it. We will start by adding a convolution layer, which is also available on TensorFlow API. So layers called the conv2D because we have a 2D matrix. We give it the number of inputs, the number of filters we want to pass through this image. As we said, we can have many filters in parallel to learn. We give it the kernel size, meaning it's the filter size. Here you can choose 3x3 filter, and also we give it our input shape. And since we said that the MNIST dataset is 28 by 28 grayscale, meaning that we have one depth here, one channel, a depth of 1. And then we also need to add a Pulley layer, as we saw. So we will add a max Pulley layer, because we said we have 2 types of pooling, max pooling and the average pooling. It's also 2D because we have 2-dimensional one, and we give it the size of the pooling filter. Then we need to flatten our output in order to pass it to the last layer, which is the fully connected layer. So we will be calling the flatten function so that we can flatten our feature map. And then we also need to add the last 2 layers, which are the same as in the dense model, which are the fully connected layers, so that we can have an output. As you can see here. We also need to compile our model the same way we did with the dense model. We need to do the CNN model here. We also need to train our model the same way we did with our dense model, and this is by using the fit function. So we fit training images, training labels, and the number of epochs. And we can see how our model does by evaluating it with the test images and the test labels once it's done training. And as you can see here, after evaluation of our model, we have an accuracy of 0.91, meaning 91%, an increase of 4% from the dense model. Thank you for watching and attending our session for today.